So this talks about sensory and hedonic evaluation of foods. What I really want to do is give you an introduction to the types of methods that we use in sensory and in consumer science. So what is sensory evaluation? Really, it's using groups of people. They can be called assessors on the one hand, but also of course consumers on the other, to provide subjective and hopefully objective measurements about food. So the measurements can be objective, usually in the case where we're using sort of trained assessors to evaluate sensory attributes. But of course, importantly, we also look for subjective measurements as well. In that case where we're using consumers to provide their hedonic judgment. In other words, how much they like a food, how much they want a food, how much they might intend to purchase it, how will they conceptualise the food itself. So therefore, maybe it's worth us having a look at an overview of sensory tests. Really, I consider sensory tests to be split into two areas. On the one hand, analytical, and on the other, affective. So within analytical sensory testing, I'm talking about trying to get objective measurements. It can be about the sensitivity, in other words, discriminating between products. Can you tell the difference between two products? It can be quantitative in terms of scaling, so it might be just, for example, can you rank things in order, or can you actually put a value on something, can you actually rate it and give it a value? Or it can be qualitative. That means, can you describe the differences between products? Usually, of course, we'd put qualitative and quantitative together, so describe and then quantify those differences. But hopefully you can see they're all sort of analytical measures. They're not talking about consumers and how much they like things. They're merely using us as people to see how much we perceive differences or what we perceive. So on the other hand, the other area of sensory testing is affective. Affective testing means we are looking at subjective measures, so measurements of things like liking and preference. Often we'll be looking at preference tests, acceptability tests, or some sort of other hedonic scale. This slide next really shows us a little bit about those questions we might be asking. Is it a discrimination test? In other words, are the products different in any way? That's an analytical test. Is the test, on the other hand, descriptive? So how do the products differ in certain specific sensory characteristics? That might be how sweet is it, or how much orange flavour is there, or how hard is the texture, or whatever. Again, that's an analytical type of test. On the other hand, if you're looking at how products are liked or preferred, then you need to go to consumers. That's affective or hedonic testing. So analytical sensory evaluation evaluates differences or similarities or qualities or quantities of sensory attributes. You can be using either a semi-trained panel or a very trained panel. If you're looking at people being able to describe and quantify differences, that would be a trained sensory panel. But in all of those cases, really, it's an analytical tool. On the other hand, if you're looking at affective measurement, evaluating preferences or acceptance or opinions about products, then you need large numbers of consumers to do that, to represent your target population. And when I say large number, really it depends how big that target population might be. So if it's a narrow demographic, then of course you can use a relatively narrow demographic in your consumer testing. On the other hand, if you're looking at a product that's meant to reach across age span and gender and different social economic groups, then your consumer test needs to represent those differences as well. But all those sorts of affective tests are involved with food choice and acceptability. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit more and look first of all at analytical sensory evaluation and what types of tests that we might be looking at. So on the one hand, we've got discrimination tests. Is there a detectable difference between the samples? For this type of test, if you're working in the food industry, you might often just use an internal panel for that. So people coming in that work for your company to come and do the testing for you. They'll need minimal screening. Really, you just need to check they've got no illnesses, no allergies, of course, and intolerances to the food. And they can have very minimal training. They really just need to understand the type of test you're running. If, on the other hand, you're then moving to descriptive tests, a descriptive test is often called a profile, a sensory profile. It's used to describe and quantify sensory attributes of samples. Often in that case, you need an external panel because you need to dedicate quite large amounts of time to actually doing the sensory task, and also you need those people to have a lot of training and they need to be there every time you need them, not off at a meeting doing something else. So in that case we'd often use an external panel that's been really screened and intensively trained and monitored and to look at their performance. So let's move back then to discrimination tests. The reason you might do a discrimination test is quite often, for example, you might have put a change of ingredient in there, either a new supplier or obviously cost release exercise, or perhaps a nutritional benefit. You want to lower salt or change the fat type in the food. In those cases, you're often really interested in the product being perceptually the same as it was before, or no perceivable difference. So really the question you're asking is, are the two stimuli different or the same in their sensory characteristics? The assessor has to be forced to choose which sample is different because you need to apply stats to the results, and therefore we need everybody to make a choice of one product or another, because the statistics will also take into consideration that they may have just guessed the answer. So we call these forced choice tests. The amount of assessors that you normally use is between sort of 30 and 60, and they only make a judgment once. They don't do repeats, they just do the assessment once. Difference tests can be useful for demonstrating small differences between treatments, really. As I said, things like ingredient change on current products. So I've given you on the slides an example of what a discrimination test might be. In the food industry, the kind of standard is called the triangle test. You've got 3 samples, 2 of which are physically identical and 1 is physically different. They look, for all intents and purposes, the same, and you present them so they look the same, but the assessor is asked which sample is different, which is the odd one out. And you're therefore trying to see if there's a perceptual difference in these physically different samples. There are other tests you could do. There's ones called duo-trio tests, where again you present 3 samples, but in this case you mark one as the standard and you say to the assessor which one of the other 2 is the same as the standard. You can also do what we call paired comparisons, and they can be directional. In other words, you could tell people what the attribute is you're looking at. So of these 2 samples, which is the sweeter, or which has the most bubbles, or whatever it is that you're interested in. So those would all be examples of discrimination tests. If we move on from there, there are other tests available to you which only require a small amount of training as well. Another would be ranking. So maybe if you've got a series of samples, again, you know they're physically different, and in this case you probably know the ingredient that you've changed has probably led to, say, a change in just one attribute. Again, it might be bitter intensity, saltiness, mint flavour, or whatever. So in this case, what you're asking the assessors to do is just to rank them in order. The reason you might do that, instead of saying, can you actually put a value on it, is most people find it easier just to rank things in order, perhaps more easily than they would to actually rate them and give a value to them. So it's relatively quick and easy. The only thing you have to be careful of is you've got to keep your sample numbers reasonably low. People can start to suffer adaptation effects, which means from the previous sample they start changing the behaviour to the next sample, really, and get confused over the samples if they've got too many to taste. So really you wouldn't go more than about 5 samples, I guess, with a ranking test. So that sort of scale is called an ordinal scale. An ordinal scale is where you just put things in order. So let's have a look at some other sorts of scaling methods then. You can also have nominal scales. A nominal scale is really a descriptive scale when you're just asking the consumer to tick the one that applies. So the example I've given you on the slides is something like the colour of bananas. You might be dark green, yellow with brown flecks, brown. The consumer's just going to tick a category. You can convert that to a number, but it doesn't mean that 9 is 9 times more than 1. It's just a nominal value that's given to that category. So that's a nominal scale. You can, however, have scales that are tick boxes again, but more structured, and these are in themselves called category scales or interval scales. So again, each position on the scale is given a descriptor, and in the 2 examples I've given you, it might be, say, tenderness of meat. It might go from extremely tender to extremely tough at the other end. The consumer, or the assessor, just sees the words and ticks the most appropriate one, and you then convert that to a score. But in this case, the scale is structured. There is an increase in intensity, I guess, from one end of the scale to the other. Again, if you looked at the example of sweetness, the values might go from not sweet to extremely sweet, and you might give just values of 1 to 5 for that. So there's no basic unit, there's no origin to the scale, but you do convert the descriptors into values afterwards. We can actually use a category scale for consumer tests as well, for a sort of a hedonic test of liking. And the most typical example of that is the 9-point hedonic scale. It's 9 points because it's got 9 categories, and it goes from like extremely at one end down to dislike extremely at the other. When the scale was developed, it was thought that the distances on the scale represented equal psychological intervals. In other words, the distance between dislike very much and dislike moderately was the same sort of interval between like slightly and like moderately. There's probably a bit more argument these days as to whether that's really true. However, I would say that the 9-point hedonic scale is still the industry standard for looking at hedonic liking of products with consumers. So moving on to the next sort of scale, we've had ordinal scales, nominal scales, structured scales, and category scales. Let's now look at moving on to lines. And one typical scale we use is the unstructured line scale, which does as it says. It's a line without any structure to it. The only way it's structured is at anchors at either end. So you might have nil at one end and extreme at the other end. This is used particularly by descriptive panels. So if you're trying to describe all the differences in a food product, and then for each of those attributes that you've described, you need to give a value to the product, we'll typically use an unstructured line scale. So you might have a line scale for mouth coating, for mouth drying, line scales for hardness of product, for sweetness, bitterness, and every attribute that's been described. So the distance along the line is then measured and converted to a value typically out of 100. In the use of those unstructured line scales, we try to encourage the assessor to use the full extent of the scale, so it's within their experience of the food product itself. Another way to capture this type of data is actually a structured scale, where you do actually have markings along the scale. That's really useful where you've got standards that represent kind of a halfway point and a 3/4 point across the scale. Then you can have references that the assessors can then refer to. It helps to anchor them on the scale, and it helps you where you want to have a more absolute value. If you've got an unstructured line scale, you're certainly never going to get towards an absolute value. So in other words, if this week you measure ripeness of tomatoes and look at the sort of the thickness of the flesh of the tomato, and you get a value of 40, that value of 40 is not absolute. It just means that between your samples, you know whether one's higher and lower than the other and the extent to which they're different. But you don't know that if you tested tomatoes next week, you'd still get a value of 40. So there's no absolute value when you use an unstructured line scale. When you use a structured line scale, you could argue that by putting standards in there, you can try to get people to more accurately anchor themselves on the scale and therefore get a more absolute value. I really, through that, have been alluding to descriptive profiling. So let's just look at that in a little bit more detail. When you want a descriptive profile of a food product, then you need to go to a very trained panel. So the reasons you might use descriptive analysis, it could be that you actually require a detailed sensory specification of your product. So for example, if you're a food manufacturer producing own label products maybe for a retailer, the retailer wants to know that your product week after week matches a specification. Now a specification on nutritional specification and quality parameters like water, colour, that sort of thing, they're not really going to tell you what the sensory perception of the product is going to be, and therefore the retailer might say to you they want a sensory specification of the product, and that's where you'd have to use profiling. Of course, you can use it within your company as well in order to compare products, maybe to compare your product to the competitor products. Also, if you're, of course, doing product development. If you're trying to do product development and you've got an idea of where your products fits in the market, then you would use competitor products and look at your product and its attributes versus the competitors. So those are the sorts of reasons you might do descriptive analysis. So therefore, if you're looking at what do those assessors actually evaluate, well, everything really. They'll go through the whole eating experience from visual, what the sample looks like, what the food looks like, what it smells like, the aroma of the product, and then once it's in the mouth, the consistency and the texture of the product and the flavour of the product. Once you're chewing it, of course, the flavour will start to go back into the nose and you'll experience the full flavour of the product. Even when you've swallowed the product, of course, you may have after effects left there as well. So a sensory panel that's doing profiling will go through that entire eating experience. So therefore, those sorts of assessors need to be, as I've already said, selected and screened. So what do we select and screen on? Of course, we need to know that they're available and they're healthy and have no allergies and intolerances, and they're interested and willing enough to do this task day after day. So once we've done that initial selection, we'll then do further screening, of course, for their sensory acuity. We need people that are fairly sensitive in terms of their sense of taste and smell and vision, etc. They also need to be able to discriminate. So they need to be able to discriminate quite small differences between products, and they need to be able to describe the differences that they can perceive and communicate them to their peers within the group as well. So it's very important to carefully select and screen your sensory panelists. There's then a whole host of different techniques that are available to us in terms of sensory profiling. On the slides I've just given you examples of the names, to be honest, of these techniques. The one that I'm going to pick up on a little bit is quantitative descriptive analysis. It's a common technique we use in Europe, but actually in Europe we often use a hybrid approach between some of these named techniques really. But if we just looked at QDA, quantitative descriptive analysis, the main key points of it really are that you're using a sensory panel of people, often sort of 8 to 12 people. Those people, those panel members, actually agree the vocabulary amongst themselves. So they develop what we call a consensus vocabulary about the product that they've all agreed upon. You may give them reference standards in order that an attribute that they've agreed in that vocabulary, they can all understand what it means. They've got a reference they can refer to remind themselves what it is. So they do that as a group, and therefore that's when the communication skills come in to develop the vocabulary. Having done that though, when it comes to scoring the products, they do that as an individual. So they go and sit in sensory booths and individually score the products against their vocabulary using those unstructured line scales that I mentioned earlier. Because we're trying to treat them very analytically, we need to look at their performance as individual assessors. We need to know how much they vary within themselves and also how much they vary between each other. And therefore we need replicate judgments. So when we do a sensory profiling task, we will do a complete repeat, either a duplicate or a triplicate, in order to get those repeat measures from people. So moving on then, I've covered discrimination testing and descriptive testing. The one thing I haven't actually mentioned is time intensity. And you can think about some products where, of course, the eating experience is very dynamic. It changes over time. A really obvious example would be chewing gum. You put chewing gum in your mouth, you expect it maybe to be sweet and minty. What can happen, obviously, is over the chew, the mint flavour may diminish. So that's a sort of a very clear example where you have this dynamic change in what's happening in the sensory attributes of a product. It can be more subtle things than that. If you all remember when low-fat snack products really became available in the UK maybe, then a lot of the criticism of the products was after a while, the flavour went. You were left with this kind of cardboard chew in the mouth. And that was because the products hadn't really been reformulated for this change of fat. So when the fat type changed, the way you perceived the attributes over time changed. So if you only looked at a single point in time, when you first tasted the product, the profile might match beautifully. But unfortunately, when you then chewed the product for longer, the profiles became different. So this is a case where you need to look at something like time intensity. Now, there's different ways of looking at time intensity measures. You can just rate at different stages of the consumption period. So, hardness on the initial bite, maybe mouthfeel or mouth coating once you chewed the product down a little bit, and have different stages of consumption and just rate at different stages. On the other hand, if it's maybe, say, a beverage product or a product that clears more rapidly, you may repeat your rating at discrete time intervals. So take a sip, rate, take another sip, rate again, and then see how the profile of the product builds up. Or you can move to continuous tracking. So this is where you actually get the assessor to continuously track the increase and decrease in a particular attribute. The advantage of that is, of course, in its nature that you've got a full picture of what's happened. The disadvantage is quite difficult for assessors to do, and you can only really do one maximum of 2 attributes at the same time by doing that technique. The last technique that I wanted to mention here is called temporal dominance, and I wanted to mention this because it's a relatively new technique. The idea of temporal dominance is that actually, when you're eating something, it might not be the actual intensity that's really important, but just what comes to mind first. The idea of this is, if you think of music instead of food for a moment, if you think of an orchestra playing, if the violins are all playing, it might be really loud. But as soon as the oboe comes in and breaks through, you'll really notice that to be very dominant. It might not be the loudness of the oboe versus the violins that's had a greater intensity, but it certainly is more dominant to you when you become aware of it in the music. So the idea is the same with foods. If you look at a glass of wine, if you drink a glass of red wine, it might be that initially, on the first, as when you first take the wine into your mouth, that you notice the aroma and perhaps the sweetness, and maybe the astringency or the bitterness of the wine become more dominant later on. So the idea of temporal dominance is that you can get assessors to continually state which attribute is most dominant at discrete time intervals. But those discrete time intervals can be very, very short, a few seconds. So that's another technique that's now available to us within sensory. So those techniques have all been really on the analytical side of sensory evaluation. And what I just want to mention before we finish is the consumer side now, consumer affective testing. This is where we are interested in subjective things, not just the intensity of perception now. Now we're interested in actually what you think about the product, how much you like it, what's your preference. So the things that we need to consider here are where to do this actual task, what to ask, and how can quantitative data actually be collected. So the first point that you need to really be aware of, or that we are aware of, is that really now you're trying to observe behaviour. And in observing natural behaviour, it's really hard to do that without actually starting to influence that behaviour. One could say that's almost nearly impossible, really. As soon as someone knows they're being observed, then their behaviour tends to change. So what sort of solutions do we have in terms of where we might carry out the testing in the first place? Well, the easiest type of testing to do in this area is called a central location trial, or a hall test. So central location trials are where we bring consumers in to us, to an environment where they're all going to taste products for us and perhaps score their liking of products. So the reason we do this is, of course, because it's very easy for us to bring people to a central location with food products. It's very easy for people to come to you rather than taking the food product out to them. But you need to be aware. You need to be aware of the fact the environment may be very inappropriate. And you can think about how to make that environment more appropriate. So if you're testing crisp products, it's probably perfectly reasonable that you're using a hall. People might be eating in a canteen at lunchtime and they're eating their crisps. That's a perfectly normal environment. On the other hand, if you're, say, looking at my example of red wine again, then red wine isn't something you'd normally stand and drink in a hall, surrounded by lots of other people necessarily. So maybe you'd think about an environment that's more suitable. In fact, people do central location trials in mock-up coffee rooms and bars in order to make the environment more appropriate. The other thing to consider is if it's a very new product, people may have had no product knowledge built up. So they're kind of coming to the product cold and don't know anything about it. They haven't built up any knowledge. So it's difficult for them to make judgments. And they may overestimate their liking of something that's completely new. So you could move from that sort of idea to using a home use trial, often called a HUT or home use trial instead. So this is where you're going to send products to people in the home to try in their normal eating environment. Of course, you've then got problems of compliance. You don't know that somebody actually did what you asked them to do, and still when they're filling in the questionnaires for you, they're likely to behave in the way they think is normal, a subjective norm. Again, with a home use trial, if you've provided the products, you're still losing any sort of cost-benefit equation as well, because they haven't actually had to pay for the product. Therefore, if you consider, well, what's the next stage from that, then of course it's going towards a test market, but that's going to cost you more money to do again. Therefore, with consumer testing, really often people will go through a series of these approaches, a central location trial to screen out ideas in the first place, before perhaps going to home use trial and test market. Other things to perhaps consider are actually getting consumers to keep diaries over the things that they've bought and consumed, to also collect information from the supermarkets about how a product is doing. Often with a store card these days, you can get an idea of demographics about the people and what they're buying and whether they're repeat purchasing your products and your competitor products as well. Actually, it's also worth thinking about questions about behavioural intent if you're looking at, say, for example, new healthier products on the market. Behavioural intent is actually can be a very good indicator of actual behaviour if it's well worded. So those sorts of questionnaires, they're worth considering as well. But so what sort of scales might we use? Well, again, the very basic scales that you might use for hedonic testing are hedonic scales, like the 9-point category scale I mentioned earlier. So that's on your slides again now. What I just wanted to compare that to is other very simple scales that people use. One's called the labelled effective magnitude scale. If you look at that scale, you think, well, it looks really similar to the 9-point hedonic liking, and indeed it is. Really, it's just made the categories slightly less evenly spread on the scale, and it's also added this greatest imaginable liking, greatest imaginable dislike to the scale. Really, the only reason for doing that is that in some cultures, people don't like to use extremes. So if you've got a 9-point scale, actually, you're probably only using 7 points of it because people don't like to use the extremes. If you put in those real extremes, people won't use them, but you might have a stretch to actually using the full 9 points. Might give you better discrimination between products. We can also use something called just about right scales as well. This is where you're now trying to get the consumer to actually think about the attribute in itself. So the example I've given you on the slides is sweetness. You know, somebody might think the product's just about right and then they're going to mark in the middle of the scale, or they might go not sweet enough or much too sweet. In this case, actually, you could use as category tick boxes, you could use a line scale. There's advantages and disadvantages to each. But the point I really want to sort of make here is that be careful about starting to ask consumers this analytical sort of question. It can be very useful to you in product development, but remember, as soon as you start to get a consumer to think analytically, then they'll start to change their behaviour. So the example of sweetness might be if you provide a series of milk and dark chocolates to people and say, how much do you like it? Some consumers might like sweet chocolates. But as soon as you've said to them to consider the sweetness of the chocolate, they then might start to think, oh yes, actually maybe I don't like sweeter chocolates. Maybe they're not so sophisticated, maybe they don't suit me. And then the next sample they won't like as much if it's sweet, and they'll start to change their behaviour towards perhaps darker chocolates. And that isn't actually a true representation of what they actually liked. So be a little bit careful when you start to ask analytical questions of consumers. And that's the sort of thing we're going to think about later in the course, really. In the course, we're going to think about, should you avoid encouraging the consumer to think analytically? And then perhaps how can you link the consumer data that you're actually getting to some of the sensory data, some of the analytical sensory data that I mentioned earlier? How can you bring those two things together? We'll also think about context effects and environment in which you do testing in. And really we need to go beyond liking, and that's the thing that we'll talk about in the course. So beyond liking, what else should we measure? Should we start to, for example, look at the conceptualization that the consumer has over the food product? So for today, that's it. Thanks very much.